It was a cold, gray morning when the staff at the city animal shelter heard the familiar sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway. The shelter was a place of many stories, stories of animals lost and found, of love and heartbreak, of second chances and forgotten ones. Yet, in this particular shelter, one story had remained largely unchanged for months. It was the story of Max, a scruffy, medium-sized dog with sad brown eyes, a patched coat and a quiet demeanor. He had been waiting for a forever home for far too long. Max had been brought to the shelter one chilly autumn afternoon after being found wandering the streets. He was dirty, thin, and obviously scared, his fur matted and his ribs visible beneath his coat. The shelter staff immediately took him in, cleaned him up, and gave him a warm bed. He was gentle and well-behaved, but something about him seemed resigned to his situation. Max had quickly become a familiar face at the shelter, but despite his calm nature and affectionate personality, he had no visitors. No one seemed interested in him. Time and time again, families walked past his kennel, their attention focused on the puppies or the flashier dogs. Max was often overlooked, forgotten amidst the chaos of barking dogs and the hustle of shelter life. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Max's world remained the same. He spent his days pacing the small, concrete pen where he was kept, occasionally sitting by the door, looking out at the world as if waiting for something. Each time the shelter's front door opened, Max's tail would wag hopefully, only for it to drop again as the people passed by without giving him a second glance. He had become accustomed to the routine of being ignored, but still he waited. He waited for someone to notice him, to see the dog that he could be, a loyal companion, a friend, a protector. The shelter workers grew fond of Max. They'd often spend a little extra time with him, petting him or giving him treats. He was sweet, never too demanding, always calm and loving. But even the kindness of the shelter staff couldn't fill the void in his heart. Max longed for the companionship of a family, for a warm home where he could rest his head at night without the cold concrete of a shelter floor. But with every passing day, the chance of that seemed to slip further away. One chilly winter afternoon, as the snow began to fall outside the shelter windows, Sarah walked in. She had visited shelters before looking for the right dog to adopt, but never quite found the right match. That day, however, was different. Sarah wasn't just looking for a dog, she was looking for a companion, a friend who could help her heal from the loneliness she had felt ever since her divorce. Sarah wasn't sure what she was looking for, but she knew she'd know when she found it. As Sarah walked through the shelter, her eyes scanning the rows of kennels, she heard a quiet whine. It wasn't loud or desperate, just a soft, almost sad sound. She turned toward the noise and saw him, the dog with the soulful eyes, sitting at the back of his kennel, looking up at her with a mixture of curiosity and hope. His coat was a bit ragged, his ears floppy, and there was a softness in his gaze that tugged at her heart. Without thinking, Sarah approached the kennel. The dog stood up slowly, his tail giving a tentative wag. She knelt down, placing her hand gently against the bars, and he cautiously stepped forward. His soft nose nudged her hand, and in that moment, something shifted inside her. She knew without a doubt that this was the dog she had been looking for. There was a connection, a silent understanding between them, and she felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Max, as the shelter workers had named him, responded to her warmth. His eyes softened and his tail wagged a little faster. Sarah reached through the bars, her fingers grazing his fur. She smiled, and for the first time in what felt like ages, she felt her heart swell with a sense of purpose. She wasn't alone anymore. There was something about this dog that made her feel like she had found the missing piece of her life. "Hey buddy," she whispered softly. "You've been waiting a long time, haven't you?" Max sat back on his haunches, his eyes never leaving her face. He had waited for so long, and now, it seemed, someone had finally noticed him. Sarah knew that she couldn't leave without him. She turned to the shelter worker who had been quietly observing the interaction. "I want to adopt him," she said, her voice firm but gentle. The shelter worker smiled, nodding in approval. "You've made a great choice. He's been here for months and he's such a sweet dog. He just needs a chance." That was all it took. Sarah filled out the necessary paperwork, and within a few hours, Max was no longer just a dog at the shelter. He was her dog. Her new companion. Her friend. The ride home was quiet, with Max sitting in the passenger seat, his head resting against the window. Sarah couldn't help but glance over at him every few moments, her heart swelling with happiness. She had found him, this lonely dog who had waited so long, and in return, he was giving her the gift of companionship. It was as though they both had something to heal from, and together, they could begin a new chapter in their lives. When they arrived at Sarah's house, Max hesitated for a moment before stepping out of the car. He was nervous but curious, his eyes scanning the new surroundings. Sarah knelt down beside him, her voice gentle. "Welcome home, Mac." As Sarah opened the door to the house, Max slowly stepped inside, his paws patting softly against the wooden floors. It was his first time in a home, his first real home, and it felt like a dream. Sarah showed him around, pointing out where his bed would be, where the food and water bowls were, and how to get outside. Max seemed to take it all in, his tail wagging with tentative excitement. That night, Sarah curled up on the couch, a warm blanket wrapped around her, while Max lay beside her, his head resting on her lap. For the first time in months, Sarah felt at peace. She stroked Max's fur, her fingers running through the soft strands, and smiled to herself. This was where they both belonged, in each other's company. Over the next few weeks, Max settled into his new home. He explored the yard, discovered the comfort of his own bed, and began to trust Sarah more and more. Each day their bond grew stronger. Max was no longer the lonely dog waiting at the shelter. He was home and he had found his family. Sarah made sure to take him on long walks, play fetch in the backyard, and give him all the love and attention he had so desperately needed. In return, Max showered her with loyalty, affection, and gratitude. But the change wasn't just in Max. Sarah found herself healing in ways she hadn't expected. Her heart, once weighed down by the pain of her past, began to lighten as she spent more time with Max. His unconditional love and gentle nature gave her the strength she needed to move forward. It was as if Max had known exactly what she needed, just as she had known what he needed. Months passed and Sarah and Max became inseparable. They went on adventures together, from hikes in the mountains to quiet afternoons in the park. Max had turned into a vibrant, happy dog, his coat shiny and his eyes bright with joy. He had found his place in the world, and so had Sarah. One afternoon, Sarah sat on the porch, Max resting by her side watching the sunset. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and the world seemed to slow down for a moment. As she looked down at Max, his head resting against her leg, Sarah realized how much her life had changed since that day at the shelter. She had gone there looking for a dog, but what she found was so much more. Max had given her a second chance at happiness, just as she had given him a second chance at life. Max, the lonely dog who had waited for months, was no longer waiting. He had found his forever home, and in doing so, he had given Sarah the gift of companionship and love. Together, they had created a miracle, a bond that neither time nor circumstance could break. And every day, Sarah was reminded that sometimes, the greatest miracles are the ones we least expect.